Aloha Tempest Fugitive. I just wanted you to know that I came across your list of 5 questions just a little while ago. I actually came across someone else who was answering your list of questions. And the questions that you posed were rather intriguing. So much so that I'm wondering if you would allow an extension of an exception in this particular case. I'm not sure exactly who or how many have actually responded to you and what their persuasion was, but I was just wondering if you would be willing to have someone who is someone of a spiritual religious faith to actually address some of those questions that you raised in all honesty and in all manner of respect and everything, without any intention of trying to throw any sort of a sermonizing spin on it or anything, but just looking at things from more of a rational point. Because one of the problems that I have with discussing issues with religion is that there seem to be 2 polar opposites. There are the atheists on one end, and you include rationalist, which I don't consider rationalist and atheism to be synonymous terms. Actually, I believe that actually one is more extreme than the other, and that extreme being that of atheist. And the other extreme on the opposite polar end of the spectrum would be your radical or religionists, or what you might refer to as fundamentalists, whatever. And between these 2 polar opposites, they tend to basically just like starting Pilikia and completely, totally ignore the vast middle ground, where there actually are people who are willing to actually have discussions, if for no other reason than to just bounce off ideas and to consider the other person's point of view and to compare notes, basically. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a sense of trying to proselytize or convert anybody, but at the very least just kind of helping people to understand the differences in thoughts and opinions, so that there will be a lot less of the animosity that really does seem to permeate between this whole discussions between the yes or no question regarding the existence of a higher supreme intelligence and whatnot. But anyway, just looking at it from an intellectual level, I thought that I would, as a person of faith, I would just kind of like to address the questions that you had laid forward. Again, not with any real agenda, but just to kind of help, I guess, allow some people out there to realize that just because someone does express faith, that we're just all just closed-minded, and that we're not willing to have actual open discussion and true debate on things of substance and issues. So if you would allow me that, then I would just like to go ahead and go through your list of questions and then just answer them according to my perspective and some thoughts and ideas and opinions that I can provide, where, if I feel like I can answer from the perspective of a rationalist slash atheist, I can try to do that. But most likely I'll be looking at it mostly from the perspective of someone who is someone of faith. But so just so I don't run out of time here, let me just go ahead and start going through these.
Utilize television, radio, and the print. See, the internet, on the other hand, is an open, bad, and some even dangerous. Is this? Given that a lot of atheists and rationalists here on YouTube debate and refute their Christian counterparts, is it not a little hypocritical of us to try and silence them, like Venom Fang X, even if we maintain that their ideas are dangerous and totally wrong?
Okay. I would consider that hypocritical, and not for the reason that you might think that I would suggest that, but simply because of the fact that we live in a country, at least here in the United States. I'm in the United States. I'm not sure where you are, but I'm sure you're in a Western country where they also adhere pretty much to the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the right to have your own philosophies and to promote your own philosophies, regardless of whether anybody agrees or disagrees. Here in the United States, we have the extreme of that, which is the whole conservative versus liberal back and forth, where personally, if I had any control over it, I would shut down certain political speech, but only when it crosses the line into the areas of being a bunch of how do I want to say this without sounding well, when it starts to cross the line into things like slander, criminal falsehoods, things of this sort. I'll just drop names: Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, what's that? Ann Coulter. People of this magnitude who are about nothing but divisiveness and who are about demonizing and trying to send the country, trying to whip it up into a mindset of fear and hatred and borderline revolution, if you will. So in situations like that, I don't understand why there isn't more of a call for any drive to actually shut down this type of speech. But in other areas where it's just a matter of people disagreeing, having different life philosophies, where nobody's really imposing anything on anybody other than, hey, I have this philosophy and you should believe in this philosophy. Well, you still have the freedom of choice to decide whether or not you want to listen to it, you want to entertain it, you want to believe, disbelieve, whatever. Nobody's going to, well, I won't say nobody, but generally speaking, and this comes from part of that whole thing about being a person of faith. Our belief is that our Creator endowed us with the gift of free will. And so similarly, in our interactions with one another, when we're discussing things such as our philosophies, we have that freedom of will to either listen or to turn away, or to embrace, or whatever. And exercising that free will, we can just easily say, hey, you can believe what you want to believe, and I can decide whether or not I want to hear it or not. And just just like vice versa, I also have the right to try to proselytize you if I feel that that's part of my commission. But you also have the right to turn away and say thanks for your interest in my soul and my salvation, whatever, but I'm not interested. And so the ideal situation, it should be that we each go our own separate ways, respecting one another's and respecting each other's perspective and points of view, and not trying to shut anybody's down or trying to stifle any sort of communication or the spreading of anybody's philosophy, whether that be God-based or non-God-based. So to answer that first question, yes, it would be hypocritical for you to actually try to shut somebody down, regardless of what you felt of their particular philosophy. So let's just go on to the next question. See what you say.
If, as many of us believe, it is right and proper to try and educate people out of a religiously fundamentalist way of thinking, which group do you think is the correct one to target, inverted commas? Is it those who have not yet developed a faith or a belief system, essentially young children, those who are of a certain religious persuasion and have been all their life, or those who were atheist rationalists and have now become Christian, to coin a hideous phrase, born again? Alternatively, should we set everybody as a priority and not focus on one specific religious demographic?
Actually, that's kind of a tough question to answer, but just viewing it from my own perspective, again, as a person of faith, our commission is to make disciples of all peoples. And it doesn't say target people who have a particular belief system already, or target people who don't have a particular belief system. It didn't mention anything about the young or the old or the rich or the poor or anything. It just basically says share the message. And so I would assume that on the flip side, that same principle, rationally speaking, would apply, which is if you feel that your philosophy trumps someone else's philosophy, then you just want to share that. Not in a sense of trying to ram your points home, of course, because I take issue with religious people who do the same thing, who they just browbeat people and they try to impose their things rather than just having a rational discussion. But if you want to share your views and your opinions and your doctrines, philosophies, ideologies, however you want to call that, and do it in a setting where there's not going to be a lot of tension and there's not this sense of that you're trying to impose your will or your belief system on somebody else, but you're actually trying to share ideas back and forth, then that's the ideal situation to be in, because it has the potential of either convincing the other person that maybe you have some points that are worth looking into, or the flip side is that that other person may actually have some things for you to consider that may make you think differently also. But I also tend to find that atheists are really resistant to those types of discussions with religious persons, with rational thinking religious persons. Now, I'm not talking about because radicals are easy to discount and basically brush to the side, because they do come across as a bunch of nutcases, and that's one of the faults of why the greater group of people who do express some faith in God, religion, whatever, are so adamantly resisted, is because of the fact that they're just too direct, they're too forceful, they're not really about trying to find consensus and discussing point counterpoint and coming to some sort of an understanding as to what the other person's thinking is. Whether or not they fall in with your belief system or not, that's irrelevant. But to share the ideas and to share the opinions and to express the good points as to why you feel that your particular philosophy is the right way or the better way. And so, as part of a mutual learning process where it's done sort of like across the board and evenly, this may sound like I may be trying to discredit atheists as a result of what I'm about to say here, but the simple fact is, based upon my observations, you really cannot sit down with atheists and having them sit down with a rational or a conversational discussion with a person of religion who's willing to have a sit-down conversation, because that leaves too much of a window open. Because typically what I find is that atheists tend to have this habit of, well, hey, if they find somebody who professes a belief in a God system or a spirituality, and they agree with many of the same points that the atheist agrees in, then atheists tend to back away from that person, because it's like, oh, now they're all not nutcases. And so if I find a rational somebody who actually believes in a higher power, and they speak as though they have some common sense, or that they believe in things like science and biology and astronomy and things of this sort, then if they can have that understanding and still have a faith-based philosophy, then that leaves me open to the potential of actually being drawn into finding out more about this whole faith-based thing. And so, in that sense, atheists are really difficult to speak with on that level. But if they're really sincere, just like any person of faith, if they're really sincere, and they come together as on a mutual level playing field, and they bounce ideas off of one another, then who's to say whose argument would win out? And so the whole idea of targeting people, I believe it's wrong. I believe the proper approach, if anybody is sincere, is to just basically have a conversation with whoever you come across and discuss your ideas, discuss your points of views, but also be receptive to whatever their particular philosophies may be as well. So if nothing else, you at least come away with a better understanding of each other, regardless of whether or not anybody wants to subscribe to the other person's particular philosophical beliefs or not. So I kind of hope I made myself clear. That was kind of long-winded, but I hope I I kind of made a rational point there, and that you kind of understand where I was going with that. So let me go on to your third point.
Question 3, linked to question 2. Why do you believe those who were once atheist or rationalist have a sudden change of heart and resort to rejoining the religious community?
I can only, well, I guess I can't only speak for myself. I mean, there are so many variables. Now, see, this is the thing about someone who comes out of non-faith and entering into faith. Different people have their different reasons, and there are so many different. How am I trying to say this? There are many different things that are influencing their decisions. So, but generally, what I think it really comes down to ultimately is the fact that we're searching for answers as a human society in all of our different areas. We all there's this innate, call it the God spark, if you will, but just seems to be this natural inclination to branch out beyond ourselves, to try to make sense of our world, to try to understand who we are and what our place is. And some people come to that realization through various different methods. Some come to that realization through some traumatic event in their lives. Others come to it as a result of not seeing humanity living up to its potential, and how we tend to do more to harm ourselves and hurt ourselves than to actually, for all of our potential, we shouldn't be causing our own suffering and pushing our entire species to the brink of extinction. So it's just like this, just this yearning for an answer as to why are we the most intelligent life form on the face of this planet, and yet we behave as the most savage and the most irrational. I mean, what other animal on the face of this planet literally and actively seeks its own extinction, or engages and interacts with members of its own species to promote the entire extinction of the entire species? And so questions like this and other deeply philosophical questions that we tend to focus upon kind of hits that, as I refer to it, the God spark, which causes us to try to find something beyond ourselves, because we look at what we're doing or what we're trying to do, and recognizing how such miserable failures that we are, then we naturally start to seek that maybe there's a higher intelligence that can actually give us some guidance to kind of help us to guide our steps more correctly. So I think that's pretty much where that comes from, ultimately. But again, as I said, there are so many different variables that are involved. Each person will come to faith based upon whatever has influenced their life. Of course, some have been raised as people of faith all their lives, and they either remain in the faith or they come to a realization for themselves. They say, well, I'm tired of all these fairy tales, and they'll fall away, and they'll tend toward agnosticism or atheism. And so it's just a matter of a constant search. It's just us searching for our identity. And for those of us who attach ourselves to a religious faith, that's part of that whole evolution, if you will, for our philosophical evolution, which is something that will try to help us to better understand our world. We have science, and so we understand all the physical, or most of it anyway, from what we are able to deduce. But there's still that yearning to understand the metaphysical, and so that's part of what drives us to try to seek something above and beyond just this physical plane, and to seek out, is there a higher intelligence, or is there a greater intelligence, or is there alternative intelligence even? So that brings to mind like your UFO conspiracy theorists, where the whole Area 51 and we've been visited by extraterrestrials and whatnot. That's part of that whole same process. We don't want to feel that we're alone, because if we feel that we're alone, then we have to wonder, then why don't we appreciate the fact that we are unique in this universe, and so that we would stop doing the things that routinely harm us and are continually perpetuating our cycle of misery and suffering. So I hope that kind of helps to answer that question.
Question 4. Depending on where you live in the world, the balance between atheism and religion may be a close-run thing or massively in favour of one over the other. Just judging on your own country, where do you see the balance shifting in the next 10 years or so? Is it going to be towards rationalist secularism or religious fundamentalism? And if it's towards the latter, which religion do you think will be most prominent in your country? Oh.
Well, speaking for the United States, again, based upon our past history and especially what we've been witnessing these past, say, 3 or 4 decades, I see it as I don't know. This is sort of like another reflection of what I was talking about at the beginning, where you have the two polar opposites. You have the extreme radicals on one end, and you have the extreme radicals on the other end, and there's this whole field of people who try to play somewhere in the middle, but more will lean toward one area, which would be your faithful and your spirituality types, and then there are others that would lean more toward the atheists. These would be your, like you say, your rationalists, your agnostics, whatnot. And so just based on that, I would say that within the next 10 years, based upon the patterns that we've seen here in the United States, I don't see much of a change. I think, if anything, you'll probably see a even split. And but it'll be mostly predominated, at least as far as what's visible and what's most influential. That this will be dominated by the radical elements of both the non-spiritual and those who claim to have a belief in spiritual things. And so between these two radical extremes, they'll be the most vocal, they'll be the most visual, they'll be the ones making the most noise. And so as a result of that, I think most of the people who are trying to be a bit more rational and a bit more agreeable are going to find themselves sort of like being in a situation where they're kind of forced to choose one way or the other. And if you stand too close to the middle, then you become a convenient target from both ends. And so that's the way that I see it in the future, is that just expect more of the same, at least for our country.
Okay, question 5, and probably the most controversial of all the questions. Again, this is for your own particular country. Imagine, if you will, the most unlikely scenario has occurred, and the two largest religious groups in your country have got to their collective breaking point and totally lost their collective shit, and they've declared war on each other, and violence is rife on the streets. Would you be willing to take up arms in favour of one side or the other? If yes, why? And if no, why not?
Well, speaking from someone whose faith happens to be based on the Christian scriptures, that answer is very simple. No, I would not take up arms and fight on either side. And just as I would not take up arms and fight with us, quote-unquote Christian country, so to speak, as the claim is made, and say, for example, that we were invaded or we were going to invade North Korea, which is strictly a cult of personality, secularist, atheist society. I would no sooner go to fight against godless, communist, atheist North Koreans than I would to fight against or on the side of any religion, because the Bible is very specific that those who profess a faith and a belief in the principles of the Christian doctrine do not take up arms and they do not fight for any reason for anybody. And there are two prominent groups in this country that fall into that category. One would be the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, and the other would be Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm sure that there are like several others, probably smaller groups, which adhere to a similar ideology, which states that, well, if we're going to be citizens of heaven, and we're going to proclaim Christ as our King, He's our leader, He's the one under whose government that we that we are the citizens of, and under that government we don't take up arms for any reason at all, as far as supporting anybody's nations or trying to claim that one's philosophy is greater than the others. Even if the attack were to turn on the people of that particular faith who declare pacifism, and whether it was the secular elements of the government or whether it was some religious elements of the government, if there was just some religious overrunning of the government, and they suddenly declared that no more will we tolerate pacifist Christians, that you either have to swear your allegiance and you have to be conscripted in the military and go fight in our wars, and if you don't, then we're just going to turn the guns on you. Well, welcome to the Roman lion dens again, because essentially the pacifist Christians are going to say, we don't care what you do, we don't care what you say, we don't care what the penalty is, we're going to obey Christ first before we obey a sinful man. And if sinful man says to do something that is counter and contrary to what the Prince of Peace says, which is to not take up arms, not to go to war, to make peace with all men, which is as best as you possibly can, then essentially we'll just be thrown to the lion's dens again, which was actually historically one of the main reasons Christians of the early Roman Empire were sent to the literal lion's dens, simply because they refused to be conscripted into the military, or they refused to hold public service, or they refused to salute and hail Caesar and things of this sort. Anything that showed any sort of a nationalistic or fervor or any sort of support for the war effort or anything. And just to use another modern day example, which I've brought up on a number of occasions, you'll find that out of all the Christians that were Nazis during Hitler's regime, the only group of Christians to actually be targeted by Hitler's National Socialists to the point of being exterminated and sent to the concentration camps were Jehovah's Witnesses, because they refused to hail Hitler, they refused to fight in the wars for the glory of the fatherland. They refused to do anything that was going to be indicative of worshiping the god of war, if you will. They wanted to be innocent of human bloodshed. So, and that spirit still lingers today, where again, pacifist Christians are really frowned upon and they're really looked down upon, and they tend to be the target, especially of other quote-unquote Christians, simply because of the fact that they won't toe the line as so many of the other Christians will. So anything such as, well, you won't support the troops, or you won't go to war for us, or you won't pledge the allegiance to the flag, or you don't all these things that are related to nationalistic fervor. And the suspicions of people who do get wrapped up in things like nationalism and patriotism are always going to be suspicious of anybody who doesn't share in that same mindset. So I kind of think that that's the best and most accurate answer that I can give you as far as that goes. And again, speaking for myself and my own particular philosophical religious beliefs, and for those who share similar beliefs of that method. But generally speaking, well, hey, Christians have fought Christians for centuries. Jews have fought Jews for centuries. Buddhists have fought Buddhists for centuries. Muslims have fought Muslims for centuries. Religion, which is supposed to be a philosophical way of life, which promotes peace and harmony, and interacting peaceably and respectfully with your fellow man. More blood has been shed in the name of somebody's religion than again, let me use as an example North Korea, purely secularist, Stalinist, atheistic state, driven by a cult of personality in humanity, human secularism, and human achievement. And yet, as warmongering as they put on the pretense of being, all they ever had was their little dispute with the southern part of Korea. Okay, the Soviet Union's a little bit of a different story. They were pretty much an expansionist situation, so that kind of that doesn't give the atheist slash secularist any sort of a clean slate either, as far as the amount of bloodshed and the amount of oppression that they're responsible for either. But by contrast, you find that there's a lot less actual warfare that was done in the name of secularism and atheism than you have found throughout the entire history of humans and whatever religious ideology that they had adopted. So religion is not without its blood guilt, and so those who truly do try to live according to the tenets of their particular religious faith or their religious philosophy recognize that under no circumstance should someone who's going to proclaim themselves as following a philosophical way of life which has as its whole tenet living peacefully and in harmony with your fellow human man, then the only rational thing would be to you just never think about taking up arms or going to war with anybody for any reason. So that's my answer to that question. So no, for me personally, and for those who really honestly truly do take the peace aspects of their religion seriously, no, they would not take up arms and fight on either side. Unfortunately, since most religious people especially, don't take their religious faith and their religious beliefs and their religious doctrines seriously enough to actually follow those tenets, well, then you're going to have the whole division where, as the scenario as you laid out, say the two major religious groups decide to go to, let's just say for the sake of this discussion here in the United States, it was the Roman Catholics and the Southern Baptists. And for whatever reason, they decided to go at it in each other, and they had their little IRA moment, I guess. And that would leave a lot of other believers kind of like standing at the sidelines wondering, oh, hey, where do we stand on all this whole thing? Well, if they were true to their religious convictions, they wouldn't have to think about it. They just say, hey, just let those nutcases duke it out amongst themselves. The Presbyterians are going to stay out of it. The Lutherans are going to stay out of it. The Mormons are going to stay out of it. The Methodists are going to stay out of it. It should be just that instant. There shouldn't be any thought involved as to whose side you'll be on, because you're on nobody's side. You're on God's side. That's the way it should be. But of course, reality being what it is, we know that's not the way that it would be. So that does raise an interesting question. How would people respond given the fact that if the two largest faiths in the country went at each other, how would all these other quote-unquote believers decide who was right and who was wrong? And the history of religion has shown time and again that they're going to pick up arms and fight. That's just the way they are, and that's just the way they're going to be until, as we say, the end of time. So anyway, as I said again, interesting questions. I hope that my contribution actually helped shed a little bit of light, at least from the perspective of somebody who is a more open-minded thinking believer, if you will, and not someone who's just beating the religious drum and just trying to shove their beliefs and their faith down somebody's throat, and denying the real world around us, so that there are those of us, believe it or not, who do not believe that the world was created in 6 literal 24-hour days, and that all these other fanciful fairy tales and stuff that some of your more extreme types like to make themselves and make everyone look like a total jackass and fool for promoting. So try to understand that there are people of faith who do appreciate things such as science and real life biology, whatnot. I mean, heck, the simplest evidence of that, I mean, gosh, look at the Islamic faith. The fact that much of our science and astronomy is as a direct result of people who professed a faith in Islam. So just simply because that someone has a faith and a belief in a higher supreme intelligence does not negate the fact that we're detached from the real world and from what we actually have to endure and live with in that real world. So I've eaten up so much time on this thing. I had no idea I was going to be eating up this much time on this thing. But anyway, I hope that this does kind of help to give you a little bit more insight into some of the different thoughts and opinions on the other side of someone who actually is a professor of faith, that that we can actually have rational discussions, and we can have a free exchange of ideas without being judgmental. So I'll just leave it off at that, and I wish you well. Aloha.